I'm building a TV stand out of Leopardwood, curly maple, and Bloodwood, and this TV stand will go into our new house. I started with marking the wood for cuts so that they would all be very close to the same length. I was going to glue them up and make them into a tabletop, and at this point I hadn't decided what kind of pattern or method I was going to use for joining, but I knew I wanted something that looked kind of like a butcher block tabletop. So I made these cuts carefully because I didn't want it to buck on me. The Bloodwood was pretty straight. So was the Leopardwood. It had a little bit of rough sawn finish on it, but the curly maple was the most rough and difficult to work with. I was really concerned about it bucking on me and then taking a bite out of it. You can see that the rough sawn edge was really more of kind of like a live edge on this maple. And I needed to straighten that out. So I snapped a chalk line down the board along the edge, and then I put it into the bandsaw and did the best I could to shave off all the rough variations off that edge. I don't have a jointer, so I needed to use my table saw as a jointer, and by straightening out this edge, if you do enough passes on the table saw, you essentially end up averaging out the variation on the edge. So with each pass, you're sort of averaging out the imperfections of the previous pass, and if you do that enough times and you just take a little bit off, just shave a little bit off the edge, you'll end up with a pretty straight edge. And I would alternate sides. So straighten one edge out, then flip it over, hit the other one. And I just did that over and over. And I did that for all three boards, the maple, here's the Leopardwood. And then I did it for the Bloodwood. And the combination of these woods together really made actually a really pretty sawdust. It was very, very fine dust, especially the Bloodwood. The Bloodwood made a very fine dust. And I made a lot of it. And you can see I was spraying all this out in the alley. I wasn't using my dust collection. It just looked like some horrible accident had occurred out there. So now I was finally able to start cutting the pieces for my pattern for the tabletop. And I had done a lot of measurements to make the final width between 12 and 13 inches, and I knew that I'd have some more planing and adjustments to do, and the final dimension of the tabletop would depend mostly on all the corrections I was going to have to do, all of the sanding and planing steps. So here's all the pieces cut, and here's a layout of how I thought I might do it. So I planed each of these individually so I could more accurately match the thicknesses. I could have done that for the boards as a whole, but this way I could see from piece to piece how much variation I had and better match them. I was having some feed issues with my planer, and I was getting some snipe, and I need to build a better planer table with in-feed and out-feed, but that'll be a later project. At least for this pass, the feeding was working the way it was supposed to. Again, sawdust all over the alley. It was actually making some really pretty patterns out in the rain. So I got out my pipe clamps and and I started testing the layout. I wasn't going to glue up yet. I just wanted to see how they might come together. I wasn't sure yet if these boards would line up, and I knew I needed to sandwich them between something straight to make them all line up in the same plane. So I just wanted to see how much difference there was, and you can just clamping them together in the horizontal direction. You can see the variation here. I was going to have to figure out something to make them line up in the vertical direction. And this is why I decided I think I was going to use a biscuit joiner. I've never done that before, and so this is the first time I was using that on a project. So I marked the locations and I tested out the first piece. And it turns out it's pretty easy to use a biscuit joiner. Relatively straightforward. Now the hard part was making sure that each piece would line up, and for the pieces that were on the interior of the pattern, they were going to have biscuits on both sides. And I was a little concerned that I was going to overlap them, so the ones on the left side would bite into the ones on the right side. Turns out I had just enough material that didn't happen. Another challenge was that in this glue up, since I have alternating sides, if I didn't keep track of which one was left and which one was right, there would be a slight bit of variation in the location of my biscuits from side to side, and that would compound. As I put the whole table together, you'd end up with a little bit of shifting left and right, and in the worst case, the whole thing would be skewed by the time it was all glued up. The lineup looked pretty good from these test pieces, so I just went for it. I was using some dark glue here, and I don't know why I thought I should do that. I guess I was just trying to match it up with the Leopardwood. And I think it's an older bottle, so it was kind of hard to squeeze out, and it was kind of cold out. I put in the biscuits and then just went back over and put as much glue down as I could squeeze out of the bottle. And after this first piece, I got rid of it and used good old Tight Bond 3. I didn't need the dark glue at all. Still made a pretty good joint, and it was fine. I was being really generous with the glue because I wasn't sure how well this would work. This is my first time using biscuits on anything. This is when I discovered there's definitely going to be an order to assembly. And so these first two pieces were sort of a test, and then I went back and started getting at the rest of it. I generated so much sawdust during this project. I don't think I've ever made this much sawdust. In fact, it ended up giving me an allergic reaction. So there's the glue up. It was a bit hectic, but it got done, and at this point I could see a bit of a cup and irregularity in the tabletop. I made some allowances for thickness, assuming that I'd either end up sanding it down or planing it or both. After seeing it like this, I thought, okay, I'm going to plane it. So it was just wide enough that it could fit through the planer. So I decided, all right, we're going to make the planer do the work here and bite down some of this mess. I was getting snipe again, and I was having a little bit of problems with the feed. You see I had to pull it through. Something I got to get in there and fix. Then I scraped a lot of the glue off and took the orbital sander to the smooth top edge. And the orbital sander actually did a great job cleaning up a lot of the snipe. I really couldn't see it as bad after that. Lots of sanding. So here I was going to square up the edge, and I was really concerned here because I didn't want to ruin this tabletop. I already had a lot of hours into it at this point. So I very carefully cut off all the rough edges. And then I cleaned up the edge with 220 with a foam sanding block. And then I just wet it down, cleaned off some of the sawdust just to get a preview of how it might look with poly. And I was really happy with it at this point. So I had this big piece of 8/4 maple that I wanted to use. I had had it on my lumber rack for years, and it was from Kime Lumber. And it was super, super heavy. I almost dropped it. Luckily, it could rest there on top of my toolbox. I was kind of freaking out because I almost dropped it. So what I was thinking I would do is cut slab legs for the table. But you can see here where it's laying on the miter saw that it actually had a little bit of a cup to it. And I was going to try to incorporate that cup into the design. Just sort of embrace the irregularity of it here. I would have to do some jointing and some planing on this ultimately anyway. What I was worried about with the planing was that then I would end up with this flat spot on the sort of convex side of the cup, and then it wouldn't work out that well. So I made this jig where I was gonna try to make this sort of, I don't know what to call it, like a trough in the face of the maple. And what this jig allowed me to do was hit the saw blade at an angle, which digs the saw blade into the material and leaves behind this little valley, this little trough. And here I am testing it out with a piece of plywood, and it didn't really work out the way I wanted it to. The trough was too thin, too small. So I just decided I would just cut 2x2 legs and put a bevel on them. And here I was testing out, I had some other pieces of maple, so I was going to use those as stringers between the legs, and I just wanted to see what might be the appropriate depth where they bond up to one another. Here's the reaction I was getting on my arm. And I didn't know what it was from. I thought I got poison ivy or something. And I went to the urgent care, and they were like, no, you've got contact dermatitis. So I still get it now. When I get around sawdust, it comes back. think this project made me allergic to sawdust. Kind of bummed about that. So I used pocket holes, and at this point we were about to move into the house and I needed to finish this project. So instead of using biscuit joints, I just went for pocket holes. And I actually spent a lot of time filling them so that you couldn't see them. It was actually probably too much time. I spent a lot of time filling them where you wouldn't see them anyway. But here's the legs. They ended up looking pretty good. I was pretty happy with that. So I had a piece of birch plywood that I was going to use for the back, and I mounted it together with the legs and mocked it up here just to get a look of what the finished product might be. It's always motivating when you can start seeing it come together. So that piece of plywood, even the underside, I put some banding on it. I cut a little strip of maple, put it on there so that you couldn't feel the plywood edge, and I did the same thing on the shelf. It's a plywood shelf, but I put a piece of maple on the front of it and tacked it in place. And then later I took a router and I beveled that edge. And I'm putting some plywood, sacrificial plywood, on the back here because I'm going to drill through with a Forstner bit. This hole will be where we can put wires through so that you can conceal the wires behind the TV stand. And then I spent a lot of time filling and sanding the pocket holes. I used little pieces of dowels that you can use to fill pocket holes, but I also used paste that I made from the sawdust. So I mixed glue and sawdust and I just pushed it in there with my fingers, and then I sanded it, and then I filled it some more, and then I sanded it, and I filled it some more. And I spent a lot of time doing this. These are pocket holes that you wouldn't even see anyway. This is all underneath the table. But I really wanted it to look like there was no plywood or pocket holes in it. It's a nice solid piece of maple there. That's the centerpiece. More pocket holes for the shelf. I glued up and screwed in the shelf. And then I filled all those pocket holes too. And here's how the shelf looked from the underside. I filled the screw hole with the dowel and flush cut that as well. And there it is, pretty much done structurally. So I put a bevel around the top, a little chamfer. I brought it out into the sunlight to see how she's going to look. Now you can see a little bit of snipe there on the end. That turned out to be a problem later. But overall, I was pretty happy with it. I really just wanted the project to get done. So there's the first coat of poly, and it was looking pretty good, but I ended up sanding and resanding many times just to keep the poly on the top looking even. I poured it on thick. I used General Finishes ArmRSeal, and then I would buff it out, and then I'd touch it up. And I did this many, many times, just trying to get rid of any imperfections. And I wanted the top to look glassy. Ultimately, I ended up achieving that, but it just took a lot of time. I think I spent 4 days.
So I've got a lot of coats on this thing, and I'm actually going over the poly on the top one more time at 150 grit, and then I'll knock it down again by hand with 220 because I kept getting sort of like bubbles and ridges, and it's real subtle, but there's still a little bit of snipe in this from when I went through the planer. There's a few low spots that I had, there were high spots that I had tried to knock down with the sander before doing the poly, and I thought I'd smooth out pretty well. And in the areas where I did have kind of puddles, I had tried to knock them down by hand and then touch them up. And when I touch them up, it leaves another puddle. So I'm just going to try to make the whole thing uniform with 150 grit. Then wipe it all off and do 220 and wipe it all off. And then do one more coat of poly. And I think that should do it. And when I do the last coat of poly, I'm just going to rub it on with a rag. I'm not going to use a brush. And I hope that will give me the smooth, glossy finish that I'm looking for. And that should be done. I want this done. This needs to be done.
So here's how it finally looked in the house. It's one of the first things we moved in, set up the TV. I was pretty happy with that. So if you like this project, please hit the like button and subscribe. And thanks for watching.